Okay. Today we're talking about the progressive era. So, major wave of reforms happening beginning the 20th century. The Square Deal, the Social Gospel, Jane Addams, the Temperance Movement, the Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act, socialism, the Open Door Policy, the Panama Canal, dollar diplomacy was called, the Progressive Party, Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom, the Federal Reserve Act, and the Keating-Owen Act. Questions, any of those? A lot going on this time period. We start seeing a lot of elements of this starting to converge in the 1890s with the populist movement. The Gilded Age, as the post-Reconstruction era, had been an age fraught with corruption on a scale never before seen in the United States. People were just tired of it. Overall, they had this sense that, we don't have to live like this. Problems created by man can be solved by man. So you have a new generation of journalists who are kind of taking advantage of this spirit of outrage and demand for reform. The muckrakers, as they were called. Magazine journalists, newspaper journalists, even novelists. One of the most famous was Upton Sinclair. In 1906, he wrote a novel called The Jungle. And there's an expose on the horrors of the meatpacking industry that existed at that time. Basically, he'd gone undercover just to kind of see how it all worked and wrote his novel. Well, the result of Sinclair's novel wasn't necessarily any kind of improvement in labor conditions. It was actually the passage of the Meat Inspection Act instead. Sinclair said, passage of this act said, aim for the people's hearts and hit them in the stomach instead. What the Meat Inspection Act did is require the United States Department of Agriculture to inspect processing plants for cleanliness. That's why you go to the grocery store today, you always see that sticker on the meat you buy, USDA approved. It means it's followed the requirements of the Meat Inspection Act. Approved for cleanliness in the processing. Let's take a look in your book here on page 725. Picture of the Armour meat packing plant here in Chicago about 1909. This is even after these reforms have gone into place here. Notice how these men are dressed here. These big stacks of meat here. They're working here this whole time. Having to hack through this meat with knives. They're using the same meat over and over again. Of course, you're working very quickly. Of course, sometimes you might hack yourself and then it's bleeding on the meat you're trying to process. But of course, they're not going to clean that up. And even here wearing hairnets. Oh, got one guy wearing a hat. The guys with these very thick mustaches, which was the style at that time. Notice how they're dressed. Short sleeves. Right. 1909, 725. 1909, there's no air conditioning. Yes, it's hot. They're working here in hot conditions next to all this meat they're about to sell to the general public. Oh, does it ever. And, of course, what happens to meat if you leave it lying out in a warm room for too long? It starts to spoil. It spoils very rapidly. So you got all those conditions coming together. So the meats that were being sold to the American public were, by today's standards, unfit for consumption. Americans are being sold rotten meat. And they try to cover this up by, dousing it in perfumes and chemicals, additives, and basically dyes, try to make it look a little bit better. Of course, these additives they're putting into it at the time are poisonous. For example, might sell a side of beef coated in this red lead dust. Make it look nicer. Of course, lead's poisonous. But they're selling it anyway. Remember, getting 20th century, they could do that. Did you have a question? Or? But essentially, food markets at that time worked on the idea, caveat emptor. The French phrase means let the buyer beware. Essentially, they felt like they could do anything, whatever product they're selling, sell it, and they had absolutely no responsibility for the consequences. Of course, we live in an age kind of where people always calling for personal responsibility for others, but I always notice those same people calling for it never really willing to live up to it themselves. Responsibilities for other people. Well, what some of the things that Sinclair talked about in his novel was you'd be having these filthy conditions like this. There'd be bugs flying around. There'd be rats falling into these processing vats. And sometimes, because poor safety conventions, people would fall into these vats. These automatic cutters, they get an arm ripped off and sold in. So that Polish sausage, that really could be a man from Poland that you're eating. So the American public decided that's just too much. We need guarantees that the food we're eating is safe for consumption, meets sanitary requirements. So the Meat Inspection Act was passed, signed into law under President Theodore Roosevelt. This is followed up by the Pure Food and Drug Act. To create, among other things, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. It's required that any preservatives or additives put in foods not be poisonous, and that any medical device or product work as advertised. As we had this time was something called snake oil salesmen. Now, these traveling medicine shows they're called. These guys pull up in this wagon and just put in a song and dance about this little product they're selling to cure all your ills. Cure everything from bad breath to cancer. Of course, it did absolutely nothing. It's called snake oil because sometimes they really were selling oil, saying, yeah, it's a liniment for your skin, it's good for you. Basically selling oil as a medicine. This is a time when doctors routinely prescribed arsenic and strychnine as medicine, rat poisons, because it treated very specific symptoms of an illness, but long term it was, of course, poisonous. This is also a time when all sorts of other products be sold over the counter. Like I say, you could get cocaine and heroin over the counter as a medicine. What the Pure Food and Drug Act did was said that all medicines had to be approved for safe for human consumption, and they do the job they're advertised to do. That is, if you're saying this product cures headaches, it better cure headaches, be proven to do so in scientific testing. If you're adding something to food to make it look better, smell better, it better not poison the public, and still must meet the Meat Inspection Act requirements. So the result of this act was The medicines you buy today, medical products like everything from pacemakers, heart stents, and everything else, they have to be safe and they have to work as advertised. So these two pieces of legislation have quite literally saved millions of lives in this country. The countries all over the world have worked to adopt the standards the U.S. put through under the Pure Food and Drug Act. Except before this, you had people dropping like flies from food poisoning, sick all the time. People dying from these medicines that were probably just a little more than poison. Now those lives are being saved. To give you an example of just how well the FDA approval process worked. In the 1950s in Europe, there was a drug being sold called thalidomide. Sold mostly in Central and Western Europe. It was a drug for pregnant women for dealing with morning sickness. Women in early stages of pregnancy that hormonal surges that makes them feel very ill a lot of times. So thalidomide is designed to ease those symptoms. And it worked. When they took thalidomide, they had reduced problems with nausea. But started learning over time that thalidomide caused horrible birth defects. Arms and legs born horribly deformed or not present at all because of the drug thalidomide. This happened to thousands and thousands of people all over Europe. But thalidomide was never approved for sale by the FDA, so it was never sold in the United States. The problems, the birth defects associated with thalidomide never happened here because of that. Just one of many examples. Now, a lot of the ideas of the progressive movement are still being debated today, and we still live a lot of the effects of it, not just these two acts here, but many more. And so we have a new desire for social and economic justice, prompting a new direction for government, for charities, for society. You have a lot of churches inspiring this, they're what they call the social gospel. Social gospel is a belief that it was the duty of Christians to reach out for the poor and work for social and economic justice. In fact, many of the agrarian movements in the West during the 1880s and 1890s, they were driven by preachers at local churches, preachers who happened to be farmers as well. There's a belief that society could be perfected and the ills of society eradicated once and for all. Temperance movement, for example, is one such movement. But the social gospel became a powerful movement of Protestant churches by the turn of the century, as well as in Catholic and Judaic churches. Salvation Army, which began in England as started by a group of veterans, well, it was the Salvation Army, became a model Christian social welfare program, quickly spread to the United States. The Salvation Army is still a very vibrant, thriving organization today. But the Salvation Army, it is a church. And so they have their own separate church services, their own ecclesiastical beliefs. But basically, it's the idea of Salvation Army always said they offer the 3 S's: soup, soap, and salvation. And they help millions of people around the country, even in our own community here. They help the homeless and those who don't have enough to eat. And he had, at the turn of the century, a lot of ministers, priests, and rabbis leaving their traditional posts and going to serve the needy. Instead of just getting the big fancy church with making a lot of money and a lot of prestige, they give up these fancy and cushy posts to go out and help the most needy in society, in the poorest neighborhoods. And so you have this mixture of religion and reform that gave progressivism a strong moral impulse that propelled the movement even further. Now, at the turn of the century, you see two sides to Protestant Christianity in the United States. The fundamentalists who believe that if you reform the soul, evil will disappear. And the modernists who believe you should reform the environment to remove temptation. The idea, since man is a sinful creature, simply remove the temptations. But even within the Protestant churches today, there's still that divide between the fundamentalists and the modernists. Rich philanthropists established charities and helped rebuild slums. And the crowded immigrant neighborhood posed a particular problem for reformers. So you have Jane Addams coming and can be called the Settlement House movement, copied by many others. Addams created a place in Chicago called Hull House. Essentially, it was a place for new immigrants to come to the United States and live. And while they're living at Hull House, they basically learn how to go along in American society. They'd learn English, they'd learn how to American morals and American customs, and they would learn any kind of important job skills they need. Well, the first of these in Chicago in 1889 quickly spread across the country, and within a few years, you have more than 400 across the United States, trying to help immigrants adjust to life in the United States. But in spite of all this element of progress, though, civil rights were not really much of a priority at this time period. A lot of progressives tend to have a very nativist sentiment. Remember, this is still a very racist time period. So the belief that Anglo-Saxons, that is those of probably white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, were the leaders of the world. You have a general respect for the democratic ethic and Christian tradition, but many are very racist, very anti-Semitic, and very anti-Catholic. But in all this as well, you also have a distrust of materialism. Progressives saw a struggle between moral forces and materialistic forces. A lot of them drew the line at what they considered to be good wealth and bad wealth. That is, good wealth is how did you make it, what do you do with it. Bad wealth, again, how did you make it, what do you do with it. So they did believe in the emerging class distinctions in American society between rich and poor, believed that everyone should have a chance to succeed. We also have a new generation of college-educated women helping a lot of these organizations, a lot of these ideas along, particularly with the Settlement House. More colleges are opening their doors to women, and more colleges just for women are appearing. For example, you have a lot of teachers' colleges opening. Getting the 20th century, if women wanted a career in the professions, basically all you could really hope to be was teacher, nurse, or secretary. That's the only options most women had open to them. There were a couple of lawyers and there were a couple of doctors around, lawyers and women doctors around, but very, very few, because most law schools, most medical schools wouldn't allow women. By 1900, in fact, 5% of all American physicians were women, but that ratio stayed the same until about the 1960s. Yeah, about 5%. They had women as doctors, but very, very few. Again, because even into the 1960s, very few medical schools would admit women. Social pressures were very heavy on women not to go into medicine in a leadership role as a doctor. Just, they're going to go into medicine, they're going as a nurse. Which is why nursing, interestingly enough, during the Civil War, been an all-male profession. Because you're seeing that they were treating soldiers, and of course those soldiers had to be undressed a lot of times because it would be unseemly for women to see a man undressed that wasn't her husband. But by the beginning of the 20th century, you have a lot of women who were interested in science, a lot of women are interested in medicine, but the only way they could get involved was as a nurse. So you had women flooding into the nursing profession, so before long it was basically almost all women in nursing. So it would be very unusual for a man to be a nurse. Well, that's starting to shift back a little bit more today. Start seeing a lot more men in the nursing profession. By the turn of the century, 2/3 of all grammar school teachers were women. And perhaps 90% of all professional women, that is, women who have a professional career, were teachers. But even then, women in teaching professions, it was mostly oriented towards the younger grades, towards younger children. College professors were almost exclusively men. Although again, by the 1960s, 1970s, that started to shift a little bit. Start seeing more women as professors, more women in leadership roles. In fact, this college, of the 4 people who have ever been president of this college, 2 of them have been women. We have a number of respected women as professors. Women's clubs began becoming more active in the community, standing beyond cultural centers and helping out the community. That is, starting libraries, helping schools, building hospitals, and so forth. Start seeing a more active interest in women's suffrage. In fact, the National American Women's Suffrage Association saw a tremendous increase in membership. With the leadership of such women as Carrie Chapman Catt, who was a journalist, and Anna Shaw, who was a social worker, membership in this organization surged from 13,000 in 1893 to more than 2 million by 1917. We have more women pushing for women getting the right to vote. The social standards at the time really stymied the movement. This is the Victorian era, and you have the idea of what's called the separate spheres. That is, the idea there's men's work and there's women's work, and the two must not mix. And politics is supposed to be men's work. As there really was the belief that if women got involved in politics, it would destroy the home and basically unravel the American family. And where you had the suffragists, you had the anti-suffragist movement as well. Men and women actually pushing against giving women the right to vote. Women too. Arguing that if women go to vote, it's going to cause divorce, promiscuity, and child neglect. And of course, none of that happened. But suffragists began arguing the opposite, saying that it made women more productive citizens, giving them the right to vote, showing that how social conditions had not deteriorated in those states and territories where women had been given the right to vote. So slowly, other states began giving the right to vote to women, again mostly out west, slowly moving back east. Washington State by 1910, California by 1911, Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona by 1912. The big win was when New York gave women the right to vote in 1917. Now, a lot of people have said, the private market should take care of all these reforms and all these problems, but again, the basic problem with the private market is it just follows what's profitable, not necessarily an idea of morality. Money and morality, remember, they're two separate things. Was the free market going to end child labor? No. Companies making too much money off sending little kids into the mines and factories. An example here, the picture on page 718. Young girl here working at a cotton mill. This is 1910. Actually, she's only getting paid maybe a fourth or a fifth of what a full-grown man be making for the same job. The company's saving a ton of money off that. Why would they change? Fact is, corporations who are actively fighting in court any attempt to try to curb child labor. So, the idea that is personal responsibility, protecting the public, making corporations and individuals accountable for what they do in business, you start having more and more regulatory acts to protect the public. So really what's more important, the company making a few bucks off selling rotten chicken or people's lives and health being protected? Like I say, if life truly is precious, then protecting people's lives and safety needs to be a priority. Well, it also became clear that the private sector and private charities couldn't quite do the entire job of solving the problems in society that need to be done. The only sector of society that had the reach and the authority to reach into the dark corners of American society was the government. The government had to step in and start doing something to help those in need. But there's a lot of corruption in government, so it was started first by cleaning up the government. By the 1890s, a new generation of activists, those who were wanting to discard the rough and tumble world of politics that kept a lot of otherwise respectful citizens from getting involved, started jumping in. And the failures of the existing system and the rise of progressivism to help these activists succeed. Give you an example here. Galveston, Texas. 1900, the city is destroyed by a hurricane. Galveston is on an island just off of a coast. Didn't have a lot of elevation of the island. Hurricane came, hit, killed 6,000 people. Drowned, washed out to sea. Well, the city spent the next several years trying to rebuild and trying to build a sandbar here, protective seawall, to keep the city from being washed away in another hurricane. But the immediate aftermath, so much destruction, that the city basically city was basically unable to function because of the existing government structure. So, in response, voters enacted a new system that replaced the old mayor-council form of government with elected nonpartisan commission. As a commission form of government. Whereas you have an elected mayor, and you have people elected to take care of very specific parts of the government. You have police commissioner, fire commissioner, sanitation commissioner, public works commissioner, so forth. You have a lot of cities that end up adopting the commission form of government. By 1920, 400 cities are operating the commission form of government. You think of Batman, Police Commissioner Jim Gordon. That was a commission form of government. So when Batman comics were created in the 1940s, a lot of cities still had that system in place. Now, this is different from the traditional mayor-council form of government. You basically have a mayor, and then you have a council of, it could be anything, where from 4 to 10 to 20 as members of the city council in the city. Basically, the mayor's in charge. City council approves various legislation ordinances for the city. Now, of course, how that was set up changed a lot in different cities. Some cities had a lot of corruption, so they went to, with the mayor's office, so they went to what they called a weak mayor form of government, where the mayor basically is just a little more just a glorified member of the city council. Doesn't have any appointed powers, any kind of offices or anything. How city council members were elected were changed. In some cities, you had so much corruption, these ward politicians, as local neighborhoods were on the take, they went to an at-large form of government, which meant that city council members would all be elected citywide. But that caused a different problem, particularly in the South. In the South, you had segregated neighborhoods, which meant African Americans and other minorities are all living just in one part of town. So if everybody has to run citywide, it meant minorities could not get a vote on the city council. So a lot of them kept what's called the aldermanic approach. That's basically running by district within a city. El Dorado, for example, it's an aldermanic form of government. That is, you have 2 members of each city council from each of the 4 wards within the city, not running citywide. Another form of government that emerged was the city manager plan, or the manager-council form of government. Because basically you have this mayor and city council in place, but you have appointed a professional, trained manager to oversee the city's day-to-day functions, answerable to the city council. In some cases directly to the mayor, but usually just the city council. So you have a lot of cities in Texas with the manager-council form of government. Most cities in Arkansas, it's a mayor-council form of government, with aldermanic government. City manager plan was first adopted by the city of Stanton, Virginia in 1908. By 1920, there are 45 cities across the United States using the manager-council form of government. Form also came to the State House, particularly the idea of initiative and referendum. This is a populist idea, game very popular in a lot of states, particularly trying to make the legislators more responsive to the needs of the people. By 1918, 20 states had either of these systems. In citizen initiatives, voters put proposed statutes on the ballot themselves and decide whether or not to approve it. Next, they can be anything. For a few years ago in Arkansas, a citizen initiative was put on the ballot regarding raising the minimum wage, and voters passed that. A lot of other things. Medical marijuana is a citizen initiative, comes on the ballot once in a while. Among many other things. Referendum, a little bit different. It's basically the legislature or the city council approves something and then sends it to the voters for a final approval or rejection. Lawmakers propose, voters approve. Most referendums passed for voters to consider usually are bond elections. It is asking voters to approve sale of a bunch of municipal or state bonds to, say, build a bunch of new highways or something. Sometimes it's a sales tax question. They'll rate a forward tax. That was a referendum put up. The wet, dry elections you see in some counties, whether or not they're going to sell alcohol or not, that's usually a referendum issue. But almost every state today has either initiative or referendum in some form. Now, y'all start seeing back beginning of the 20th century was recall elections. That is, citizens can vote to recall elected officials. That is, if politician's elected and decides he's not going to do his job any, or is very corrupt, or they just don't like him, or they're going against the will of the people, they can have another election middle of the guy's term and basically vote whether or not to fire him, this member of the government. Except some states have this, some don't. Some only for limited offices. In Texas, it's mostly for mayors, mostly local level mayors and city council members. But out west in states like Arizona and California, even North Dakota, you can recall anybody from city council up to members of Congress and the governor. About 12, 13 years ago, in California, they voted to recall their governor. Sometimes you see attempts to try to recall U.S. senators out to Arizona and California. And basically, though, it takes a citizen petition first to get this process started. The direct primary, being an election year, be hearing about the difference between primaries and caucus elections. Again, the direct primaries process is designed to bring government more directly to the people. Texas, for example, adopted a direct primary in 1905, and by 1915, every state in the Union had initiated a primary for at least some offices. Now, primary is basically when the party holds an election, and any member of that party can step up and vote for who that nominee for the party is going to be. Now, who can vote in these elections, it depends. In some states, you register by party. Arkansas, Texas, several other states, you don't vote by party. You don't register by party. Basically, you just declare yourself a Democrat or Republican just simply by when you show up to vote the primary. For example, Democratic primary in Union County this year, sheriff's race. Basically, two candidates on the ballot. The party is deciding who's going to be the nominee for sheriff. And so Democrats are voting the Democratic primary to decide it's going to be this one guy or this other. But since there's no Republican opposition in the fall, the winner of this primary is going to be the sheriff. But otherwise, if there had been, say, a Republican candidate for it, the winner of the primary would have faced the winner of the Republican primary, and in the fall they would have had the general election, had all the voters decide. So they just simply declared Democrats or declared Republicans. A lot of states have primary elections for who their choice is going to be for president. Which slate of delegates is going to be sent to the National Convention to nominate a party's choice for president. In Arkansas, we have a primary, but we saw this weekend in Nevada and in Iowa and several other states, they have what's called a caucus. An old-fashioned system, very time-consuming, or just going in, just pressing a button or marking it something name on the ballot. The caucus is a little different. It's a lot older than the primary. It's designed strictly just for the most energetic of the party faithful. basically what happens is you go to your precinct at a particular time. It says you don't have 2 weeks early voting, early caucusing. Basically, it's at one particular time. Everybody gathers, and basically they send you to, if you're for this one candidate, send you to one part of the room. If you're for this other candidate, send you to the other part of the room. And to count how many are one side or the other. At least wheeling and dealing. People would change their minds, go back and forth, but basically you're sent to different parts of the room to decide, okay, how many in this precinct are for this one candidate, how many for the other. And send that up to the county level, then to the district level, and to the state level. Doing that over and over and over again until finally decide who is the winner of that caucus for that state or that district or whatever. It's a very time-consuming process, but it's designed strictly for, again, for the most energetic of the party faithful, those willing to go at a particular time and go through this process, which can last a couple hours. And even before the caucus system, they had the direct convention. Basically, only members of a convention can go, meet at this particular time, this particular place, and they decide who is going to be the candidate for the party for these particular races. So not a caucus, not a primary, but basically members of the convention deciding it, nominating these different people, these different offices. But the primary was adopted as being more responsive to the will of the people. And start seeing more states initiating different commissions to try to oversee different aspects of government. For example, in New York, Governor Charles Evans Hughes created the Public Utilities Commission to oversee the state's utilities. That is, rates of what rates water and electric companies are going to charge. And so in New York, that was an elected commission. In Arkansas, it's an appointed commission, appointed by the governor. And now these different commissions being appointed for very specific purposes. In the 1890s, for example, in Texas, they created the Railroad Commission. Again, created by a populace to regulate the railroad hauling rates. That's an office just for Texas. In Oklahoma, they created what's called the Corporation Commission. Again, designed to oversee the activities of different corporations. Different states, like say Oklahoma and Louisiana, they have the Insurance Commission office. Again, to oversee prices of insurers, make sure they're treating their customers fairly, they're charging fair rates, and so on and so forth. In New Jersey, in 1910, Governor Woodrow Wilson was elected. Again, that's setting about that, challenging the state's corporation laws to stop the formation of trusts. Wisconsin, you have Robert M. La Follette, elected as a reformer and initiated a whole slew of different reforms. You can picture them here on page 717. It's called Battling Bog. He initiated utility reforms, railroad regulations, direct primaries for offices in Wisconsin, initiative referendum in Wisconsin, graduate taxes on inherited fortunes. It's greatly expanded the state's education system, university system. It's going to be a great voice for progress in Wisconsin, and served in the Senate afterward for many, many years. And of course, reform got a helping hand from the nation's first progressive president, Theodore Roosevelt. In his first term, he accomplished little as a conservative, still dominated Congress, but America liked the new president overall. Roosevelt, at the age of 42, was the youngest president in American history. He traveled, joked, gave thunderous speeches across the country, what he called the bully pulpits. He always had new and interesting guests at the White House. His son, years later, once said about his father, said, he wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. He always wanted to be the center of attention. His children, all very young, spilled all over the White House, always getting different kinds of mischief. For example, there was a time the Roosevelt kids let a pony ride in the White House elevator. And Roosevelt, of course, himself had an equal amount of exuberance, always looking for a new adventure. friend of his once said when people kind of raised their eyebrows at the activities of the president, they said, we have to understand about the president, he's only about 6. But Roosevelt denounced anarchists, assassins, defended tariff schedules early on in his presidency. But he also argued that the old antitrust laws were not sufficient. There was some evil in a large corporation. That is, this power of a corporation unchecked by anyone else, power that had over thousands of lives and millions of customers. The answer to no one. When Roosevelt started saying things like this, that worried a lot of conservatives. Nevertheless, Congress passed the Newlands Act in 1902 to try to irrigate the West, established the Department of Commerce, the means of overseeing and aiding business. And the Elkins Act was also passed, which forbade railroads to give rebates, but had no enforcement teeth. Again, make sure there's fairness in hauling rates. In February 1902, his Attorney General, a man named Philander C. Knox, actual name, Knox, an old corporate attorney, announced a lawsuit under the Sherman Antitrust Act, which a lot of people thought was dead. Now, the Roosevelt administration would be taking on major railroad holding corporations, which caused Wall Street to panic. Basically, Knox is going to go in and start busting up these railroads. And they broke up 44 trusts over the next few years. Now, Roosevelt never saw himself as a particular a crusade of his to break up these trusts, but believe that there were some good monopolies and there's some bad monopolies. What he's doing is he's going after what he considers to be the bad monopolies. And he went in and he made others, he made what called gentlemen's agreements to these others, that if they changed certain practices, the government would leave them alone. And Roosevelt, for his presidency, they made those forms, he kept his word. He didn't try to break them up. But on the monopoly issue, though, Roosevelt was something kind of a moderate. You had some who said, leave it alone, let the free market take care of it, and others said, break up all the monopolies, or something have the government take them all over. In May 1902, 50,000 anthracite coal miners went on strike. They're working 12-hour days, 7 days a week. The owners refused to compromise. The public worried that a coal strike could damage the country. Well, the owners, meanwhile, lectured the country about private property. But Roosevelt, meantime, sent a committee of labor to investigate just what's going on with this strike. What are they striking over? What's the corporation saying? The owners refused to talk to this delegation, but labor is willing to talk, and they had a lot to say. The owners, meanwhile, ordered Roosevelt to throw the workers in jail, which insulted Roosevelt. You just don't tell Roosevelt what to do. He didn't work for those people. So instead, Roosevelt sent in 10,000 troops to take over the mines, keeping the workers and the owners from accessing them. Now he has the attention of the corporations, basically telling them they're not going to access these mines until they sit down and talk. So they invited labor and management alike to come to the White House to negotiate, and eventually they came up with settlements. Coal miners got a pay raise, cut in hours, but mine owners, though, instituted a modest hike in coal prices to make up for this. So what ends up happening, though, is this is the first time that the federal government arbitrates a strike between laborers and owners. So they brokered an agreement. But it's also the first time the federal government ever threatened to take over an entire industry, too. Well, Roosevelt called this settlement a square deal. Basically said it was even and fair for everyone. And in the 1904 election, he kept saying that he wanted to take the spirit of this deal, the square deal, to other areas of American life. It became a major issue in the 1904 election. Roosevelt was very popular. People liked the idea of the square deal. Next day, he's against a no-name Democrat, Alton B. Parker. Never heard of before or since. Roosevelt wins easily. Gets 57.4% of the vote, 336 electoral votes. Parker gets 37.6%, 140 electoral votes. The socialist candidate, Eugene Debs, jumps on the ballot, does very well, gets 400,000 votes. .3%. Prohibition candidate, man named Silas Swallow, actual name, gets out the rest to 1.9%. So it goes to Roosevelt. TR wins in a landslide. And so he starts taking the square deal and expanding it to other areas. Some things more successful than others. Oh, you know the story of the teddy bear? Roosevelt was an avid outdoorsman, a conservationist. He added millions of acres of national parkland to the country. But he was out hunting one day out west, and he shot this mother bear and didn't realize that she had a cub with her. And his friends tell him, just shoot the cub, put it out of its misery. And Roosevelt says, no, I'm not going to shoot this little bear cub. Bear cub was eventually taken to the zoo, but the whole country heard about this story. He wouldn't shoot the bear cub, and so before long, every little kid in the country has a little stuffed bear, a teddy bear, named after Teddy Roosevelt. Well, square deal, we saw some of its effects with the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. There's two parts of it. You have the Hepburn Railroad Regulation Act, I don't need to worry about, to strengthen the Interstate Commerce Commission, but basically strengthen the Elkins Act, the ban on railroad rebates, giving federal regulators more power to look over railroad accounts and so forth. Roosevelt looked at other reforms in 1907. For example, he pushed for an 8-hour workday for workers. Didn't pass, but tried to expand workers' compensation for accidents, inheritance and income taxes, stock market regulation. He attacked what he called the plutocracy of the Republican Party. It was basically government by moneyed interests. In fact, he once tried to change the English language to change the rules of spelling from standardized form to phonetic spelling. That is, spell words how they sound. And unfortunately, people had to go through spelling tests. No, it didn't catch on. That's some interesting ideas. In 1901, there were only 500,000 acres existing as national parkland in the United States. By the time Roosevelt left office in 1909, expanded to more than 15 million acres. The National Monuments Act was passed in 1909 just as he left office to strengthen the President's power to protect historic sites from destruction. On foreign policy, Roosevelt was always an activist, a believer in American power and prestige, and believed in expanding America's power overseas. He once described his foreign policy using an old West African proverb: "Speak softly and carry a big stick, and you'll go far." Roosevelt, however, made a clear distinction what he considered to be a civilized nation and an uncivilized nation. Civilized nation is what he considered to be Anglo-Saxon or Germanic, and uncivilized, generally non-white, Latin, or Slavic nations, the Southern or Eastern European nations. But economic development made a crucial difference for Roosevelt. The rise of Japan, for example, militarily and industrially, made Roosevelt consider Japan to be a civilized nation. But he believes civilized nations, though, were for the producers of manufactured goods, while the undeveloped nations, uncivilized nations, furnished raw materials and markets, creating this kind of symbiotic relationship. The raw material supplies from the uncivilized part of the world go be processed and developed in the civilized world and distributed around the world back to these customers in the undeveloped world. And so because of this, he believed civilized nations had a right and a duty even to interfere in the affairs of backwards and less developed nations. In 1904, he announced what came to be known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, claiming the U.S. had not only the right to oppose intervention in the Caribbean Sea area, but the U.S. also had the right to intervene itself in the domestic affairs of the hemisphere if it threatened the peace and stability of the region. So as a result of this, in 1904, the United States government sent the military in to seize the customs revenue of the Dominican Republic. Basically, went in and seized control of their treasury because the Dominican Republic couldn't pay their debts back to the countries, particularly the United States. In 1902, the United States forced Cuba to accept the Platt Amendment to its Constitution. That's Senator Thomas Platt of Pennsylvania, which said the United States had the right to prevent any foreign power from intruding in Cuba. Basically, the United States forced Cuba to write into its Constitution that the United States had a veto over its foreign policy. In fact, in 1906, Roosevelt sent troops to Cuba to maintain order to prevent possible intervention by other powers. Also, that became called the open door policy. Here in China, the European powers are carving up the dying realm of the Manchu dynasty into spheres of economic influence, basically colonies. Now, these spheres of influence in China basically were exclusive trade zones. Basically, if you're in the English sphere of influence, that area can only trade with England. Same for France, for Germany, for Russia, for Japan. Basically, they're carving it up among themselves and even fighting among themselves. But of course, anybody asked China what they felt about this? No. In fact, China is so weak that it can't resist this foreign intervention. Actually, in 1898, for example, Britain leased the city of Hong Kong from China, basically bought it for 99 years for next to nothing. They returned it in 1997. Nations of the area so hostile over these spheres of influence, they've been going to war with each other, particularly the Russo-Japanese War. 1904-1905. Russia and Japan go to war with each other, and Roosevelt intervenes here. He basically has both parties send delegates to New Hampshire, where he works out a peace agreement between Japan and Russia. Theodore Roosevelt ends up getting the Nobel Peace Prize because of his efforts in 1906. And after this, Roosevelt began more forcefully advocating the open door policy for China, which is allowing all nations to come in and trade with China equally. No spheres of influence. Everybody comes in, anybody can trade. Of course, this is the American position on it. Of course, China's position on the issue just was ignored. What they wanted was just kind of tossed aside.